There is a kind of exhaustion that has no clinical name. It arrives on Sunday evenings, a slow gravitational pull that has nothing to do with tiredness and everything to do with dread. Not dread of Monday specifically, dread of the shape of the week, its rigidity, its demand that you carve yourself into a form that fits the hours between 9 and 5, park the rest of yourself somewhere, and retrieve it again when the bell rings. The sufferers of this dread tend to assume something is wrong with them, that they are lazy or ungrateful or constitutionally unsuited to the discipline that other, more serious people seem to inhabit without friction. They scroll job listings. They book therapy. They read books about productivity and try to engineer themselves into someone who can sit at a desk for 8 hours without feeling like an animal pressing itself against the walls of an enclosure it was never designed to fit. The therapy doesn't fix it. The productivity systems don't fix it. Because the enclosure is real, and the animal inside it is not broken, it is ancient. What follows is not a critique of capitalism, or a manifesto for remote work, or an argument for the 4-day week, though people with agendas will try to pull it in each of those directions. This is something more precise. A forensic examination of the mismatch between the biological architecture of the human brain and the structural demands of modern institutional labor. The mismatch is not a matter of personal failing. It is a design incompatibility built into the foundation of how industrialized societies organized human time, and understanding it is the first step toward using it rather than being used by it. For 99% of human evolutionary history, the brain was not built inside an office. It was built on a savanna, in a forest, along a riverbank, inside a social unit of roughly 50 to 150 people. The cognitive architecture being operated right now, the circuits for attention, motivation, threat detection, social bonding, time perception, were engineered by approximately 300,000 years of ancestral pressure into a machine optimized for a world that no longer exists. Evolutionary biologists call this mismatch theory. The idea that many of the difficulties modern humans experience are not signs of pathology, but signs of an organism whose hardware was built for one environment being run in a radically different one. Randolph Ness and George Williams laid much of this groundwork in their 1994 book Why We Get Sick, but the principle extends far beyond medicine. It reaches into every corner of how modern people live, and nowhere more acutely than in the structure of how they are expected to work. The ancestral brain had no concept of a 9-hour block of time. Research in behavioral ecology has consistently demonstrated that hunter-gatherer subsistence labor, the actual work of obtaining food, maintaining shelter, and managing social relationships, averaged somewhere between 3 and 5 hours per day. The rest was structured around what we would now call high-variability engagement. Bursts of intense physical and cognitive effort followed by rest, social interaction, storytelling, play, and unstructured time. The anthropologist Marshall Solins, in his landmark 1972 essay collection Stone Age Economics, made the case, provocatively, controversially, and with substantial ethnographic evidence, that pre-agricultural peoples were, by most measurable standards, less overworked than their industrial descendants. They had more discretionary time. They engaged in fewer hours of sustained, repetitive labor. The work they did do was varied, socially embedded, and directly connected to visible, immediate outcomes. The brain that emerged from this environment runs on dopamine in ways that the modern office absolutely does not accommodate. The dopamine system, the brain's primary motivation and reward architecture, did not evolve to anticipate a quarterly performance review. It evolved to respond to immediate, variable, high-salience feedback. The variability is the key. Neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz's foundational research on dopamine-producing neurons, conducted through the late 1980s and 1990s, demonstrated that the sharpest dopamine spike occurs not when a reward arrives, but when the arrival of a reward is unpredictable. The brain lights up for uncertainty resolved, for a hunt that may or may not end in a kill, for a social gamble that may or may not pay off. The fixed salary, the reliable paycheck, the structured reward arriving on the same schedule every 2 weeks. This is, from a neurochemical standpoint, one of the least stimulating incentive structures imaginable. It is a system engineered to reduce variability, and the brain is a system that runs on it. Compound this with the architecture of attention. The human brain was not designed for sustained, single-task focus across multi-hour intervals. Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine, has spent decades studying workplace attention and found that workers average roughly 20 minutes on a task before their attention shifts, and that after an interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes to fully return to focused engagement with the original task. The open-plan office, the constant email, the Slack notification, these are not simply inconveniences. They are environmental conditions that trigger a very old threat detection reflex. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for sustained executive function and long-range planning, goes offline quickly when the amygdala, the brain's sentinel for sudden environmental signals, fires. The ancestral logic is airtight. A rustle in the grass is not something to ignore while finishing a thought. But in the modern office, there are hundreds of rustles per day, and none of them are predators, and the prefrontal cortex pays for every single one. There is also the matter of social architecture. The human brain evolved inside a band-level society. The social unit it is calibrated for is small, stable, and personally intimate. The trust systems, the reciprocity circuits, the systems for reading facial expression and body language and subtle shifts in social hierarchy, all of this was optimized for a group where every member was known, their history was known, their reliability had been personally tested over years. The corporation is the opposite. It is a social environment of strangers managed through bureaucratic proxy, where loyalty flows upward toward roles rather than downward toward people, where the trust relationships that the brain craves are constantly disrupted by turnover, reorganization, layoffs, and the grinding anonymity of institutional scale. Robin Dunbar's research on social group size, his famous number of approximately 150 individuals as the cognitive ceiling for meaningful social relationships, suggests that most large organizations exceed the brain's capacity for genuine social belonging by orders of magnitude. Employees in corporations of thousands are not simply navigating a large social environment. They are running social software on a system that was never meant to scale that high. Here is where the conventional framing breaks, and breaks badly. The standard narrative around workplace dissatisfaction positions it as a problem of bad management, toxic cultures, poor work-life balance, or insufficient pay. Fix the management, redesign the culture, pay people better, and the problem resolves. This framing has produced an entire industry: human resources consulting, employee engagement surveys, well-being initiatives, ping-pong tables, meditation apps subsidized by the same companies that require their employees to answer emails at 10 o'clock at night. The industry exists because the framing is profitable. It positions the problem as solvable within the existing structure, by the existing institutions, using the existing logic. And the engagement scores tick up marginally for a quarter, and then decline, and the consultants return, and the cycle repeats. But the brain does not care about the ping-pong table. The brain is running an operating system that is roughly 300,000 years old, and the ping-pong table was installed yesterday. The discomfort people feel is not a symptom of insufficient amenities. It is a structural signal, a persistent friction between what the cognitive architecture requires and what the institutional architecture provides. What the brain actually needs: variable reward cycles, high social intimacy, physical movement integrated into the daily rhythm, visible and immediate connection between effort and outcome, autonomy over time management, and enough genuine downtime for memory consolidation and creative integration to occur. What the modern 9-to-5 provides: fixed reward cycles, shallow social anonymity, enforced sedentism, diffuse and deferred connection between effort and outcome, scheduled autonomy during 2 weeks of annual leave, and cognitive demand that continues past the point of neurological diminishing returns. The discomfort is not a personal failure. It is evidence that the system is working exactly as designed, not for the human inside it, but for the institution requiring predictable, schedulable, accountable units of labor. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the engineer whose 1911 Principles of Scientific Management became the intellectual foundation of modern workplace organization, was explicit about this. His goal was not human flourishing. His goal was the optimization of the human as a component within a production system, the elimination of variation, the standardization of movement, the reduction of individual judgment in favor of procedural compliance. Taylorism did not die with the industrial age. It migrated into the white-collar office as surely as it had once lived on the factory floor. The quarterly targets, the performance metrics, the KPI dashboards, These are Taylor's ghosts, dressed in the language of modern management theory.
Consider the specific neurological cost of sustained desk labor. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Applied Physiology found that 6 hours of continuous sitting produces measurable suppression of cerebral blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for precisely the kind of complex, creative, strategic cognition that most knowledge work employers claim to be paying for. The body's default mode, the posture of enforced metabolic efficiency, the seated, still, screen-facing position, actively degrades the cognitive function the work demands. The sedentary office is an arrangement that undermines itself at the biological level. And yet the architecture of institutional labor has not adapted to this finding, because the finding was published in 2020 and the architecture was designed in 1911. And institutional inertia moves at a pace that has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with control. There is a deeper irony still. The brain's default mode network, the neural system that activates during rest, during mind wandering, during states of low external demand, is not idle during these periods. It is doing critical consolidation work. The neuroscientist Marcus Raichle, who first formally identified the default mode network in 2001, described it as the brain's background processing system, the architecture responsible for autobiographical memory integration, creative problem-solving, perspective-taking, and what might loosely be called wisdom, the ability to synthesize experience into pattern. It activates precisely when conscious attention is not being directed anywhere in particular. The modern office, with its mandate for sustained, directed attention and its hostility to what looks like unproductive staring into the distance, systematically suppresses the one neural system most responsible for the highest-order cognitive outputs that modern economies actually run on. The organization that demands constant productivity is, at the neurological level, extracting short-term compliance at the cost of long-term insight. This is the machinery underneath the malaise. Not bad management. Not insufficient benefits. A biological organism optimized for one kind of world, running inside an institutional structure designed for a fundamentally different one, and the institution's design winning, every day, at the cost of the organism's output, creativity, and psychological coherence. Pause. What the understanding of this mechanism actually permits is not escape. Escape is a fantasy, and fantasies are for people who have not yet decided to think clearly. What it permits is leverage, a cold-eyed repositioning of the self within the structure, using the structure's logic against its own inefficiencies. The first strategic reframe: stop interpreting your neurological resistance as a character defect. The person who cannot maintain deep focus past the third hour of a spreadsheet is not lazy. They're operating according to the brain's actual attentional limits. Research by Anders Ericsson, who's spent his career studying peak performance and is best known for his work on deliberate practice, found that elite performers across disciplines rarely sustain more than 4 hours of deep, high-quality focused work per day. The rest of their time is structured recovery, intentional rest, and the kind of low-demand activity that allows consolidation. If the institution demands more than 4 hours of genuine cognitive effort, it is not demanding more output. It is demanding the performance of output while receiving diminishing returns. Understanding this means you can begin to architect your actual productive hours with precision, protecting the windows where genuine depth is possible, and using the remaining hours for lower cognitive tasks rather than grinding unsuccessfully at work that requires a prefrontal cortex running at capacity. The second strategic reframe: variable reward is the currency the brain actually runs on, and the salaried employment structure deliberately removes it to create compliance. Recognizing this means recognizing that the motivational flatness you feel inside a fixed compensation structure is not a personal emotional problem. It is the predictable output of a reward system optimized for institutional control rather than human engagement. The practical response is to engineer variability into your own incentive architecture wherever the structure permits, personal milestones with real stakes, project-based targets with genuine uncertainty. Skill acquisition in areas where the feedback loop is short and the outcomes are visible. The goal is not to recreate the ancestral hunt inside the office cubicle. The goal is to give the dopamine system enough variability to stay alive within an environment designed to flatten it.
The third strategic reframe, and the most powerful one: institutions are not obligated to tell you where the leverage points are. Frederick Taylor's heirs in management theory are not designing organizations to help you understand the gap between your biological needs and their institutional demands. They are designing organizations to manage that gap on behalf of the institution. But the gap itself is information. The person who understands why they are experiencing friction inside a structure is equipped to navigate it with a precision that the person who blames themselves for the friction never achieves. You do not fix a design incompatibility through personal resolve. You work around it through strategic positioning, identifying which aspects of the structure can be shaped, which boundaries can be negotiated, and which institutional demands can be met with minimum biological cost while maximum strategic energy is preserved for the moves that matter. The organism that survives is not the one that submits to the enclosure without noticing the walls. It is the one that maps the enclosure precisely, identifies where the walls are thinnest, and applies pressure there. Not frantically, precisely, with full understanding of what it is doing and why. The Sunday dread does not go away entirely. It is, in a way, honest, a signal from an ancient nervous system that has correctly identified a mismatch between what it was built for and what it has been asked to do. The question is whether that signal gets interpreted as a personal indictment or as information. Most people choose the indictment because institutions spend enormous resources ensuring that interpretation prevails. The self-help section of any bookstore is largely a monument to that success. A library of solutions to a problem the solutions do not understand, written for people who have accepted the framing that something is wrong with them rather than with the architecture they have been handed. The Stoics had a concept they called amor fati, love of fate, an embrace of circumstances as they are rather than as one wishes them to be. Marcus Aurelius sat inside one of the most demanding institutional structures in human history, the Roman imperial bureaucracy, and ran it for 19 years with his full faculties intact. He did not do this by pretending the structure was something other than what it was. He did it by understanding its nature completely, refusing to mistake it for the totality of human possibility, and carving out within it the space required to remain, in some essential sense, himself. That space was not given to him. He maintained it by knowing exactly where the walls were.